My name is Daniel and I'm 34 years old. When I was 9 years old, I watched my father's suitcase sit by the front door for 3 days before he finally picked it up and left. It was an old brown suitcase with a broken zipper he'd fixed with a paperclip, and I remember staring at it every morning before school, wondering if today would be the day it disappeared. I remember the sound it made rolling across our kitchen tile, a slow, dragging sound, like something being torn instead of ended all at once. My mother stood at the sink the whole time, washing a single coffee cup over and over, the water running long after the cup was clean, not looking at him. I promised myself that day that if I ever built a family of my own, no one would ever pack a bag and walk out that easily. I would be the man whose home never had a suitcase waiting by the door. For 12 years, I tried to build exactly that. I worked 2 jobs in my 20s, stacking weekend shifts at a warehouse, just to save enough for a house with a real driveway, a real sense of permanence. I learned to cook because my wife Melissa worked long hours as a hospital administrator, and I wanted her to come home to something warm on the stove instead of an empty kitchen. I never raised my voice in 8 years of marriage, because I remembered exactly what raised voices sounded like right before a suitcase disappeared down a driveway. My younger brother's fiancée, Priya, 29, a physical therapist with a laugh that filled a room, was the first to notice something was wrong, months before I let myself see it. At a birthday dinner, over candles and half-eaten cake, she leaned over and said quietly, "Daniel, you keep checking your phone like you're waiting for bad news." I laughed it off, blamed it on work stress. I didn't know yet that I was waiting for bad news. I just didn't know from where. 14 days before our 8th anniversary, Melissa told me she had a work conference in Denver. 3 nights, she said, zipping her suitcase shut without looking up. Hospital Administrators Summit. I didn't know yet that her phone was still logged into our shared family location app, the one we'd set up 2 years earlier after her car broke down on a dark highway and I'd spent 4 hours not knowing where she was. She'd forgotten to turn it off. At 5 a.m. the next morning, unable to sleep, I opened the app expecting to see her near a Denver convention center. Instead, the blue dot sat still at a small mountain cabin 3 hours outside Denver, not a hotel, not a conference site. My stomach dropped, but I didn't call her. I sat alone in the dark kitchen, in the same chair my mother used to sit in, thinking about the sound of suitcase wheels on tile. I want to be fair to Melissa, even now, because it would be easy to make her into a villain with no shading. She wasn't cruel by nature. She was 36, ambitious, terrified of becoming her own mother, who had given up a career to raise 4 kids and resented every year of it, a resentment that used to fill our own dinners with a tension I never fully understood until much later. Melissa's fear wasn't really of me, it was of disappearing into a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like the one we'd built. That fear doesn't excuse what she did, but it explains why she needed to feel chosen by someone new, someone who didn't already know every tired version of her. For Melissa, control meant staying 2 steps ahead of a life she was afraid of losing herself inside. I didn't confront her over the phone. Instead, 3 years earlier, when we bought our house, I had quietly insisted the deed carry a clause protecting the down payment I'd made from my grandmother's inheritance. Melissa had barely glanced at that paperwork, trusting me to handle the boring stuff. I pulled the folder out now and read it twice, calmly, at the kitchen table, the overhead light humming faintly above me. I wasn't as powerless in this marriage as I had let myself feel over the past few months. I had simply never needed to know that until now. There was one complication I hadn't expected. My brother Marcus, 31, called 2 days later, his voice tight, the kind of tight that meant he'd been rehearsing the call in his head for hours. He'd seen a coworker's blurry social media photo from the mountain cabin, Melissa laughing beside a man he didn't recognize, a glass of wine in her hand, mountains behind them instead of a conference banner. He'd sat on it for a full day, scrolling past it and back again, afraid of being the one to break something that couldn't be unbroken. I kept telling myself maybe it was nothing, he admitted. A coworker, a friend, I don't know. I didn't want to be the reason your marriage ends. I told him the truth, it wasn't him. It had already ended the moment she packed a suitcase for a trip that didn't exist. I just hadn't said the words out loud yet. I thanked him for telling me anyway, and I meant it. Silence from someone who loves you can be its own kind of betrayal. Melissa came home 4 days later, tanned in a way that didn't match 3 nights spent indoors at a conference center, talking easily about breakout sessions and keynote speakers. I quietly suspected she'd looked up online on the drive home, just in case I asked. She kissed my cheek at the door like nothing had happened, and for a moment I almost let myself believe her, because believing her was so much easier than what I already knew. We had an anniversary. At my parents' house, the same kitchen where the suitcase had once sat by the door, where my mother had once washed one coffee cup over and over. My mother had insisted on hosting. 8 years deserves a proper dinner, she'd said on the phone, and I didn't argue. I had my own reasons for wanting witnesses in the room. The dinner was warm at first, candles flickering low, my mother's roast chicken filling the kitchen with the smell of rosemary, Marcus refilling water glasses just to avoid meeting my eyes. Melissa told a story about a panel on hospital staffing that had never happened, her voice light, almost proud, like she'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. I let her finish every word. Then, calmly, without raising my voice, without so much as a tremor in my hand, I set my phone on the table, screen facing her, showing the location history from 14 nights earlier, the blue dot, still, unmoving, sitting at a small cabin 3 hours from Denver. The table went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a full house after a good meal, but the sharp, ringing kind. My father set down his fork slowly, the metal clinking once against the plate. My mother's hand froze over the serving spoon, halfway to Marcus's plate. "This is not a mistake," I said quietly. "It's been sitting in this app for 2 weeks. I've had 2 weeks to decide how I wanted to say this out loud, and I decided I wanted to say it here, with the people who love both of us, so no one has to wonder later what really happened." Melissa's face went white, then red. "Daniel, it's not what," she started, but there was nothing true left to finish that sentence with. Marcus stared at his plate. My mother quietly took my hand under the table, the same hand that had once washed one coffee cup, over and over, saying nothing. This time she wasn't the one staying silent. Melissa was. "I'm not going to yell," I told her, my voice steady even as my hands weren't. "I never have, and I'm not starting tonight, at my parents' table, on our anniversary. But I need you to know, 3 years ago I made sure I'd never be afraid of losing the house, and 2 weeks ago I found out I never needed to be afraid of losing you either. Because I already had." Melissa didn't answer. She looked around the table, at my father's lowered eyes, at Marcus staring hard at the tablecloth, at my mother's hand still wrapped around mine, and something in her seemed to understand there was no version of this dinner that ended with her explaining her way back in. She left the table first. No one stopped her. The front door closed behind her, softly, not slammed, and somehow that quiet click felt louder than any suitcase will ever had. In the weeks that followed, Melissa moved into an apartment across town, a one-bedroom place near the hospital where she still worked long hours. I didn't fight over the house, it had always legally protected what mattered to me, and I made sure the settlement was fair, splitting what we'd genuinely built together evenly, down to the dollar, even the parts one didn't have to share. My lawyer said I could have pushed harder, could have used the affair to my advantage in ways that would have hurt her financially for years. I didn't want to win a war. I wanted to close a door quietly, the opposite of the one that had haunted me since I was 9 years old, dragging its wheels across kitchen tile. 3 months later, I sat in that same kitchen on a Sunday morning, sunlight coming through the window over the sink, making coffee in a single mug, no one washing it over and over, no one waiting for a suitcase to disappear down the driveway. The house was quiet in a way that finally felt peaceful instead of empty. Marcus and Priya came by that afternoon. Their wedding is in the spring, and Priya asked, gently, if I'd stand up as a groomsman. "Only if the toast doesn't turn into your therapy session," she laughed, nudging my shoulder. For the first time in a long time, I meant it when I said I'd try to behave. If you've ever sat in a room and quietly known something was wrong before anyone said it out loud, hear this: you're allowed to gather your proof in peace before you ever raise your voice. You're allowed to stay calm not because it doesn't hurt, but because your calm is its own kind of strength. You're allowed to protect yourself years before you ever need to, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. Breaking a cycle doesn't always look like a dramatic exit. Sometimes it looks like sitting at a quiet kitchen table, finally at peace with a door that closes softly instead of one that slams. Sometimes healing is simply refusing to become the version of the story you were most afraid of. If this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. Subscribe, because every story here is for someone who needed to hear it tonight.